The morning in Texas, 1869, and the Denton Creek Square was packed with people. A new gallows had just been built there. Hanging from it was a large Apache woman, her muscular body hardened by the Sunday. Her neck was bound with a rough hemp rope, and her bare feet were caked with dried blood. The executioner read out the sentence with a voice full of contempt. Protest against government orders. Attacking white men. Spreading rebellion. The crowd jeered, throwing bottle shards and rocks at the platform. But the woman did not shed a tear. She held her head high, her coal-black eyes locked onto the man about to pull the lever, and spat straight into his face. "Hang me if you want," she shouted in broken English. "Because I will die standing. Never on my knees." In the crowd, Grant McCade stood silently. A middle-aged man with a face carved by war. He watched the scene as if his insides were on fire. He had seen death more than enough of it, but never a spirit this unbreakable. As the hangman placed his hand on the lever, Grant stepped forward, his voice rising above the murmurs. "Wait, I want to buy her." The crowd burst into mocking laughter. "How much are you paying for this wild beast?" One man sneered. Grant clenched his fists. $50, he said, clearly and firmly. Silence fell over the square. The hangman looked toward the sheriff. The sheriff shrugged. "Money is money. Let her down." The rope was loosened. The woman collapsed to the ground, still staring at Grant with blazing eyes, not with gratitude, but with fury. And from that moment on, the fates of those two people were tied together, like the noose that had not yet tightened. That afternoon, the wind from the prairie carried the scent of dry grass and dust, seeping into every crevice of the weathered wooden house where Grant had lived alone for years. He placed the Apache woman now with her hands tied to prevent her from attacking down on the floor near the fireplace. She remained silent, her eyes like burning coals, scorching any explanation he might have tried to offer. "I do not mean to hurt you," Grant said, his voice rough from years unused for comfort. "I just wanted to save your life." She laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Save me? A white man saving an Apache from a white man's noose? That is the cruelest joke I have ever heard." Grant said nothing. He left a bowl of water and a piece of cornbread, then stepped outside, leaving her alone with her fury. But as night fell, he could still hear the clinking of chains. She was trying to break free and escape. The next morning, Grant woke up to find her gone from where she had been lying. The storage room door had been forced open, drawers torn through. But it was not the mess that stunned him into silence. It was the torn letter lying on the floor. It was an old letter his father, Thomas McCade, had written 30 years ago to a business associate. "The Cartwright Ranch is now ours. We burned their village to the ground. No one survived." Grant picked up the piece of paper, his heart sinking like a stone. He knew she had read it, and he knew the fire in her eyes would now burn fiercer than ever. Later that evening, he found her by a small stream behind the ranch. The ropes were gone, and a kitchen knife was in her hand. As he approached, she turned like a panther, pressing the blade to his throat. "You are the son of Thomas McCade," she said, her voice low and hissing through clenched teeth. "The man who burned my village, the one who killed my mother." Grant did not back away. He looked straight into her blazing eyes. "Yes, I am his son, but I am not him. His blood runs through your veins," she screamed, her hand trembling. "People died because of your family's greed. Do you think $50 can wash away that sin?" "No," Grant answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it is the only thing I could do. I could not watch another Apache die." The blade in her hand trembled, then slowly lowered. She turned away, her shoulders shaking with rage. In her eyes, there was not just hatred but a pain that had never been given a name. Grant knew the rope of vengeance would not break easily, but he also knew that the moment she chose not to drive that knife into his chest was the first moment of something new. A chance to make things right. 3 days later, the Texas sky unleashed the first heavy rain of the season. Cold wind whipped across the cracked earth, kicking up red dust and dry leaves into swirling gusts. Inside the small wooden house, the air between Grant and the Apache woman was tight as a drawn bow, the silence so thick Even the crackle of burning firewood sounded as loud as gunfire. She still had not spoken a word to him. She ate only after he left the room, slept only when he was outside, and when their eyes accidentally met, she turned away, as if just looking at him made her blood boil. But on the third night, that silence was shattered. The sound of hooves, then shouting. A group of 4 slave hunters burst through the broken gate of the ranch. Grant barely reached for his Winchester before they crashed through the door. "We're here to take back our property," the leader shouted, aiming his Colt straight at Grant's chest. "You think you can buy that savage and keep her? You're a damn fool." Grant did not hesitate. He dove to the side and fired. The gunshot cracked like thunder, dropping one of them instantly. But the other 3 charged. A rifle butt smashed into Grant's shoulder, sending him sprawling, blood from a gash on his forehead blinding his eyes. The Apache woman, still called a name they spat with contempt, stood frozen in the corner. But then, her black eyes lit up. She lunged at the nearest man, twisting his wrist until his gun hit the floor, then spun and drove a brutal kick into the second man's chest. Her strength was fast, precise, and filled with rage like a wild animal cornered with no way out. A bullet grazed Grant's shoulder, but he had already gotten back up. He fired one final shot and took down the last attacker. Silence returned to the house, broken only by the pounding rain on the wooden roof and the heaving breaths of the 2 survivors. Grant leaned against the wall, blood seeping from his shoulder. She stood before him, chest rising and falling. The knife in her hand still trembling, not from fury now, but from something deeper. For the first time, their eyes met without pure hatred. There was something else there, perhaps recognition, maybe even gratitude. "You did not run," she said quietly, her voice still sharp, as if trying to hide something deeper. "And you did not leave me behind," Grant replied with a faint smile. She turned away, as if ashamed of herself. "I did not do it for you. I did it because I will not be dragged back into that hell again. Whatever the reason," Grant said, handing her a roll of bandages. "We're still alive." Her hand touched his wound for the first time, not to kill, but to heal. And in the cold rain outside, something fragile began to grow. Not forgiveness, but the recognition that they were now fighting on the same side. The rain cleared by the next morning, leaving behind a Texas sky as gray as ash, and the faint scent of gunpowder lingering around the wooden house. Grant was repairing the broken doorframe when the sound of hooves echoed from a distance, steady, heavy, and unmistakably threatening. He looked out across the field, where a group of riders in long coats was approaching. Leading them was a man with a wide-brimmed hat and eyes as cold as steel. "Sheriff Dalton," Grant muttered, the name landing like a stone in his throat. Dalton stopped his horse at the gate, no need for introductions. Anyone living in Denton Creek knew him, a sheriff on paper. But in truth, the one pulling the strings behind human trafficking routes, hunting down Apaches and selling them across the border. "Good morning, Mr. McCade," Dalton said, his voice light as a breeze but carrying the scent of gunpowder. "I heard you made a little purchase without filing the proper paperwork with the authorities." Grant stood in the doorway, his hand resting lightly on his Winchester. "I did not purchase property. I saved a person." Dalton raised an eyebrow. "Since when did savages start counting as people in the law books, huh?" Inside, the Apache woman stood behind the wooden door, her grip tightening on the knife. Every word from his mouth made her breath quicken like a cornered animal. "Hand her over," Dalton said, his voice now sharp, "or I will have reason to search this place. And when that happens, I fear you will lose more than just your land. You will lose your life." Grant said nothing. In that moment, he thought of everything he had tried to leave behind, the blood-stained legacy of his father, the mistakes that could never be undone. But then his eyes shifted to the crack in the door, catching a glimpse of hers watching from within. There was no hatred now, only the gaze of someone placing all their hope in the thinnest thread of trust. "No," Grant said, his voice like steel. "She stays." The air turned to stone. Dalton gave a thin smile, the kind worn by men who were used to being obeyed. "Very well, I will take that as a declaration of war." He pulled the reins and turned his horse, but before disappearing over the ridge, he looked back. "Do not sleep too soundly, McCade. I do not knock twice." The red dust from the horse's hooves had not even settled. But Grant already knew one thing. This time, Dalton would not come back just to make threats. He would bring hell with him. Inside, the woman stepped out, still holding the knife. "You could give me up. No one would blame you." Grant shook his head. "No, if I handed you over, I would be no better than my father, and I swore I would never become him." She stood in silence, then turned to face the door. Outside, the wind had begun to rise over the prairie, carrying the scent of an oncoming storm. They both knew the night ahead would not be a peaceful one. "Thank you for being here," the narrator's voice would say. "If this story reminded you of old days of red dust evenings and hoofbeats echoing in your heart, then subscribe to my channel, so each day we can sit together once again, and I will tell you another tale from the Wild West." 3 nights later, the western sky over Denton Creek lit up with flames. The wind carried the scent of gunpowder and burning flesh, signaling what Grant had quietly prepared for Dalton had returned. Grant stood on the porch, Winchester ready in hand. The Apache woman who now had introduced herself as Lena stood beside him, her muscular body bare beneath torn deerskin, black eyes blazing. She had demanded a weapon, and Grant had given her the revolver he once carried in the war. "There is no turning back now," Grant said, eyes locked on the dusty road in the distance. "I have never known how to turn back," Lena replied, her voice low and thunderous. The pounding of hooves grew louder. From the darkness, dozens of mounted riders emerged, carrying torches and guns. Leading them was Dalton, his lips twisted into a vicious smile. "McCade, tonight, you will learn that anyone who defies this law will be crushed." Grant took a deep breath. "This is not law. This is a crime," Dalton scoffed. "A crime? Let us see how long your so-called justice lasts." Then the order came. The attack began. Bullets whistled past the rooftop. Torches were hurled into the stables, bursting into flames. Grant and Lena rushed into position, returning fire. Every shot from Grant's Winchester was as precise as when he once commanded a company. Lena moved like the wind, shooting while rolling to dodge bullets, her muscles tensing under the flickering firelight. One man burst through the window. Lena swept his legs out with a sharp kick and pulled the trigger without hesitation. 2 others closed in on Grant. He smashed one with the butt of his rifle and drove the bayonet into the second. The whole house had turned into a battlefield in flames. Screams echoed as one of Dalton's men was struck by a torch, setting the dry grass ablaze. The horses panicked, throwing the ranks into chaos. Grant seized the moment, gunning down each man trying to flee. In the midst of the chaos, Dalton drew his weapon. He aimed directly at Lena as she reloaded. Grant saw it and did not think. He lunged, shoving her out of the bullet's path. The shot hit his shoulder, blood soaking through his shirt. "Grant!" Lena cried, catching his falling body. But he still clutched his rifle, teeth clenched from the pain. "Do not let him get away," Lena roared like a wild beast. She rose amid the storm of bullets, eyes blazing. Every shot she fired was a curse for the years of oppression. Finally, Dalton was thrown from his horse, his hand torn, his gun falling to the dirt. The battle faded. The surviving soldiers dropped their weapons and ran. Smoke and fire painted the Texas night sky red. Grant collapsed onto the porch steps, breath ragged. Lena knelt beside him, holding his shoulder, her hand trembling not from hate, but from the fear of losing the only person who had ever stood beside her. "I am still alive," he whispered, "and justice is not finished yet." The morning after was as pale as ashes, following a long night of violence. Smoke still curled up from the charred remains of the stables, and the earth around the ranch was soaked in red. Grant lay on the wooden bed, his shoulder bandaged, his breathing labored. Lena sat beside him, her calloused hands that had never known gentleness now trembling each time she changed his dressing. "Why did you do it?" she asked softly, not meeting his eyes. "You could have turned me in and saved your own life." Grant gave a tired smile, his gaze drifting far away. "Because I stood by for too long. My whole life, I looked away when I saw wrong being done. This time, I wanted to stand on the right side." Outside, the town of Denton Creek boiled like a pot left too long on the fire. Word of the battle had spread. The townsfolk who had long turned a blind eye began to question the man they once called the keeper of the law. For the first time, whispers rose. Was Dalton truly a sheriff? Or just a trafficker in a badge? 2 days later, a public hearing was held in the very square where Lena had nearly been hanged. Hundreds gathered. Grant, still weak, walked to the platform with a cane, Lena at his side. Below them stood Dalton, hands bound, face bruised with fury. "We all know who he is," Grant began, his voice hoarse but firm. "A man who used the law to hide his crimes. A man who hunted Apache people like wild animals. A man who burned their village to steal this land." Dalton screamed, "Lies, lies from a madman and a savage. Who would believe them?" "I do," a voice rang out from the crowd, then another, and another still. A ranch owner confessed to buying labor from Dalton. A patrolman admitted to taking bribes to ignore the trucks crossing the border. Each truth was a blade. Peeling away Dalton's mask, Lena stepped forward, her black eyes piercing through him. "You can call me savage. You can hang me. But you cannot kill the truth. And the truth is, my father died in the fire you and your men lit. Today, justice will speak. For those who never got the chance." No one objected. The town council voted to remove Dalton from his position and handed him over to the federal court. As he was dragged away, his eyes burned with hatred but held no power anymore. That evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, Lena stood alone by the half-burned fence. Grant joined her, standing silently at her side. "The fire burned down my past," she said quietly. "But maybe, from the ashes, I can grow something new." Grant nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And I will be here, to help you plant it." A week later, the Texas sky turned blue again, as if no blood had ever been spilled on this land. The last rain of the season had washed away all traces of the battle, leaving behind only the scent of damp earth and the whisper of wind through the tall grass. The McCade Ranch now stood as nothing more than a charred skeleton, but Grant and Lena remained. They began rebuilding the horse stable with old planks of wood, patching the roof with sheets of tin salvaged from the ruins. Each hammer strike was a beat of rebirth, every drop of sweat a promise of a new beginning. Lena worked tirelessly. The hands that once knew only chains now gripped hammers and rope with confidence. Her arms were strong, her shoulders slick with sweat, and her black eyes burned with a quiet, fierce determination. Grant watched from afar, sometimes just smiling in silence. In her, he saw a strength he had long forgotten, the belief that even when everything is broken, people can still rebuild it with their own hands. At night, as the warm yellow glow of the oil lamp lit up the new wooden walls, they sat side by side without speaking. They did not need words. Between them was a rare silence, the kind that comes only after hatred has burned itself out. One day, a small group of wandering Apache arrived from the south, women, children, and a few warriors who had survived the raids. They came to the ranch, their eyes wary. Lena stepped forward and spoke in the language of her people. After a while, their expressions softened. Grant brought water and cornbread. That night, they all sat around the fire in the yard. For the first time since the war, Apache songs rose again on this land, slow, somber, but full of hope. A little boy sitting beside Lena asked in hesitant English, "Were you a prisoner?" She looked over at Grant, then gently shook her head. "No. Not here. No one is a prisoner anymore." The next day, they built a large shelter behind the ranch for those seeking refuge. Grant looked at the scorched porch post, then took out his knife and carved into the wood a rough inscription, "McCade, Apache Homestead." Lena placed her hand over the carving, then etched beneath it a tribal symbol, two intersecting lines, representing two souls who once stood against each other, now bound as one. That afternoon, Grant and Lena stood together on the hill, watching the sunset cast a golden light across the newly seeded fields. Fresh furrows, new hands, and a future yet to be written. But this time, no one would have to kneel. "What now?" Grant asked, his voice rough. Lena smiled softly, her eyes finally calm after so many storms. "Now, we plant. and we wait for it to grow. 1 month later, spring returned to the Texas plains. The sky was so clear it felt like you could see through the thin layers of cloud. The wind carried the scent of fresh grass as it swept across a land once soaked in blood and smoke. The McCade Ranch had changed fences, stood tall again, and the green fields stretched all the way to the distant hills. And in that land, the laughter of Apache children rang out in the morning Sunday. Grant stood on the porch, holding a cup of hot coffee, watching the scene with a faint smile at the corner of his lips. Every morning, he witnessed the same quiet miracle. Lena, the Apache woman who once stood beneath a noose, now teaching children, baking bread, mending saddles. Her figure was tall and strong, but her voice was low and unexpectedly gentle. Seeing him, she squinted and smiled. "What are you staring at, McCade?" "Something I thought I would never see," he replied, his voice rough. She shook her head and poured a bucket of water over the new garden rose. "Anything can happen." Grant stepped forward to help her tie off the rope, his hands trembling, his old wound still aching when the wind shifted. "Do you ever regret not leaving this place?" Lena looked up. The sunlight caught her bronze skin and deep black eyes, eyes like a well with no bottom. "If I had left, I would have carried hatred with me. But staying, I get to plant something else." I chose to stay. A strong breeze passed by, bringing the scent of grain and wood smoke. In the distance, other Apache people were building a new cattle pen. From the ashes, a small community was rising, a place where those once enslaved and those once guilty now shared the land as equals. As the day faded and the sun dipped behind the mountains, golden light poured across the newly built wooden house. Lena carved another line into the symbol on the porch post, a horizontal stroke, meaning, "A cycle has ended, and a new life begins." Grant sat on the step, watching her hand press against the wood, and quietly said, "You do not belong to anyone anymore, Lena. You belong to yourself, and to this land." She turned to him, her face still strong, but her eyes soft. "No, McCade. We belong to something bigger, something we both once lost. Faith." They sat together in silence, watching a new dawn rise. Morning light stretched across the fresh young grass, where life was blooming again on soil once stained with blood. In the wild lands, where law was written in bullets and fear, there were still those who chose to stand tall. They knew that justice was sometimes no more than a faint flicker in the dark, but still, they walked toward it. Because true courage does not destroy evil, it keeps goodness alive long enough to bloom. It has been an honor sharing this story with you, dear viewers of Wild West Storytelling. I truly hope that wherever you are, you find happiness and peace. I love you all. And now, tell me, what did you think of this story? Leave a comment down below. Type 1 if you enjoyed this tale. And do not forget to subscribe for more thrilling stories from the Wild West.